Hi, I'm Amy Ziering, and I'm delighted to be part of the Little Market's Conversation with Changemakers series to celebrate International Women's Day. The Little Market is a nonprofit organization committed to breaking the cycle of poverty for women globally. I'm here today to talk with two amazing young women and activists, Kamilah Willingham and Chanel Miller. Welcome, Kamilah and Chanel. I'm going to ask you both to introduce yourselves to everyone who's watching.
Hey, Amy and Kamilah. So good to be with you today. My name is Chanel Miller. I'm the author of Know My Name, and I'm also an artist and an activist.
Hi, Amy and Chanel. I'm Kamilah Willingham. I'm a writer and activist.
Former lawyer.
Yeah.
Lawyer. Yeah.
A survivor of the legal world.
Well, thank you guys. It was so sweet of you to say okay and be game for this. And I'm so thrilled. You know, I have a crazy backstory with each of you. Chanel, yours might be crazier. For those that don't know, we've never actually met, but we have a very strange and powerful pivotal connection, right? Would you say? At least in terms, it's very, I play a very minor part in Chanel's world, but it kind of was a strange moment that led to incredible cultural change. And can I tell the story, Chanel? Is that okay? Yeah. I don't even think you know it. I was sitting on.
I don't know, actually.
I know, you don't actually know what I'm saying. So I was sitting on, I'm in my house. I was actually sitting on that couch that you guys can't see and working at home, and my cell phone blew up, and it was our mutual friend, Michelle Daubert. And she was like, I'm dying. I'm in the courtroom. I'm listening to this woman speak. Wow. And she said, I have goosebumps, Amy. If I get you the transcript, if I somehow can get you the transcript, can we get it out? Can you get it to any of your journalist friends? Can we get it out there in the world? Like, the world has to hear what this woman is saying in court today. And she was at the end of the trial, right? Your assailant's trial, where you spoke to the judge so eloquently. And so I said, send it to me. And she got it and sent it to me. And I read it and was shook. And I started texting journalists I knew. And I got it to
Katie Baker.
Katie Baker.
Bestie. Yeah.
Who I knew from the work I do. And I'm like, Katie, and I said, you got to read this. And she's like, it's late. I'm going out to dinner with friends in New York. I said, like, no, drop everything, fucking read this. And and I didn't hear from her. And I went to bed, and I'm in LA, and I was like so invested. And I remember waking up at like 5 a.m. My cell phone was blowing up, and it was BuzzFeed. And they were like, and Katie was like, the editors are in tears. They want to run the whole thing. Can you ask Chanel for permission? And I was like, oh my God. So I texted you through Michelle, and you didn't know me. You're like, who's this crazy lady in LA? Like, right? Yeah. And then they ran it. And the reason I say that was such a pivotal is because that became, I think it still is, the number one news article ever shared on BuzzFeed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, it's so interesting. I remember after the sentencing, my friends took me out to get frozen yogurt to cheer me up. And we were all so deflated. And I remember Michelle calling, and I just stepped outside away from my yogurt. She said, can we release this? I was like, sure. You know, like Amy had suggested BuzzFeed. I said, okay, just make sure my name's not on it. And that night I was totally devastated. Like, I went to sleep thinking I had failed. I was totally embarrassed about everything that had happened. I regretted letting my family in to see me read it. Like, I didn't know who I thought I was to reclaim my identity. Like, and it actually still disturbs me today. Like, if I hadn't said yes on the phone outside of Froyo, I would have continued existing in a reality where I didn't understand the power of my voice, that I didn't know, the power my writing could hold. And like, how closely those realities exist is so scary to me. And I'm so blessed to be here and be launched into the alternate one, where I come into my being and get a book deal, and I'm out here with a memoir, and now we're face to face. But it scares me so much how thin that line is. And I think, we'll go more into that later, but that's still wild to me.
Yeah, and how life is just this crazy set of accidents. The fact that I knew Michelle,
Yeah.
That I had enough clout, to get Katie's ear and just, say, look, listen, this is important, because this was a different world then in time. Everyone has to remember too. I mean, this was not when these sort of stories were championed and heralded, easily. But Chanel, how did you have the wherewithal to write that? That's all what I've always wanted to ask you in that moment. Because that was it's a work of art. It's exquisite. It's rage and pain, but it's put there so poetically, and poignantly and raw, all at once. Were you in a trance state? Were you just how did that happen?
Well, first I want to say what you just said about giving it over to Katie and having those connections. I want to make it clear that, survivors are heralded as people who continue to triumph time and time again and have that resilience. But I gave up on myself throughout the entire process so many times. There's so many days where I said, I refuse to move forward. I am telling you I cannot do this. And it was other people who prompted me or carved a path forward that I could walk just to get a little bit farther. And it's the same. I remember right after the sentencing, my partner was reassuring me, it's okay. We're going to get your story out there. We'll continue this fight. And I was like, no, I don't think you understand. It's done. That was everything I had. I'm done. I want to go home. I want to continue my life. And then the world continues your story, right? And so I think that's such an important piece that people need to understand. And then in terms of writing, I majored in literature. I think Kamilah also majored in English, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my whole college experience was really intense book clubs. And I remember thinking when my advocate told me, she said, you should be jotting down things as they happen. This was early on before the trial. And she said, if you come out of this with a guilty verdict, you will have the opportunity to read a victim impact statement. And I said, what is that? And she said, it's a document of your thoughts and feelings. And I was like, I have a degree in documenting my thoughts and feelings. And I remember feeling like this kid messed with the wrong person. This is all I do, And so I would make notes in my phone constantly, and I never revisited them until the end. And then I sat down. I had a week maybe to get it together. I emailed myself all the notes, and just that week it was trance-like. I didn't leave my apartment. I was so angry. It was really physical writing. Yeah.
It's amazing. You had the wherewithal and the gifts to do that, and that your voice spoke for so many. I mean, that's what was so powerful, right? I mean, I remember when that thing went viral, and the incoming social media and the outrage and the love, from other people who don't have that voice, who don't have that platform. Like you said at the start, it is this set of survivors do feel so alone and isolated, and you had a set of lucky circumstances and accidents, but it's important for all of us to remember that, A, that doesn't happen to everyone, but B, it's why all of us together should look out and try and be that happy accident for someone, have those open ears and those open hearts, and, see a way to sort of lift others, when they're in pain, and hear their stories and not turn away. Absolutely. So I want to go to Kamilah, who I also have a crazy story with. We reached out to Kamilah. We were doing a film on campus assaults. We did a film called The Invisible War, which broke the story of the epidemic of rape in the US military. And this was in 2010, when no one was telling these stories. And this is just of interest. We at that time were fairly established filmmakers. And yet what we were hearing from everyone was, no one wants to hear, when we pitched it, no one wants to hear women's stories. No one wants to hear stories about women being raped. And no one certainly wants to hear stories about women being raped in the military. So it was we could not get any money. And Kirby and I just went around the country on our own, Kirby shooting, no crew, me doing all the interviews. We ended up making a film called The Invisible War. And it played on, and it actually ended up doing really well, surprisingly, and then played on campuses. And every time we went to a campus, students would come up to us when we showed this film and say, you don't need to go to the military. This happened to me here at Bowdoin, at USC. So that led to the film, The Hunting Ground. And we got in touch with Kamilah, and she showed up at a house we were renting in the Palisades. I remember the first interview, and it was a similar transformative experience, honestly, to reading your work, Chanel. I did this interview, and it was like an out-of-body experience. It was profound. Kamilah is brilliant, and it also was so brave, because Kamilah, when I added to your biography that you're a lawyer, she'd gone to Harvard Law, and that's the institution she was calling out, which is not something, and I don't know, most people would do, and certainly not something a Black woman would do. And so I was almost, I was like, oh, who are you? And how do you exist? And I love you. And, and we went on, she ended up letting us follow her story, and she became one of the main stories in The Hunting Ground. So Kamilah, do you remember that first moment? And what was it like? Because I don't think before then you had spoken at length about your story to anyone.
I hadn't spoken to anyone outside of like a close group of friends who were similarly angry. And I didn't really feel connected to any movement then, because it was like 2014 when we met. And I was in law school. Like at that time, there wasn't really, at least accessible to me, like an activist community on campus. There were like wine clubs and like junior corporate lawyers and people who like 1 in 3 guys on campus wanted to be president. But there wasn't much of a movement except for the classes I ended up taking, which were all like gender violence, family law, sex equality. And that was how I decided that I wanted to do that kind of work as a lawyer. And that was a context in which I was assaulted by a classmate. And I had this feeling of like helplessness because I'd started the process with my school, and that was obviously not promising. And I think by the time that I'd met you, they'd, found him responsible for assaulting me and then taken it all back. And the criminal process, it was like, 3-4 years out, and I was still waiting for trial. And I didn't know that at the time he had powerful friends kind of helping him game the system, powerful friends who ended up being Harvard Law professors. And so I was just really angry, and I was still at the time I was working with survivors of prisoner rape, and I was enraged on their account. I was enraged for myself. And my attorney was like, hey, I met this documentary film crew and they're doing a film on campus sexual assault. Do you want to talk to them? And I was like, screw it. Yeah, I do. I just had this feeling of like, I don't know. I felt like they were writing my story, my assailant and his defense attorneys and the school. I felt so like just diminished by them. The way that like I'd been a student of theirs, I'd been part of the community, and I felt completely dismissed and kind of crushed in the end by them. And it felt like I was being told, like the message was like, kind of worthless. And they really counted on my silence. And they counted on my, having invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and getting a legal education. And like a lot of people in that position, we don't want to risk it by speaking out. And I was like, well, you picked the wrong one, because I maybe recklessly don't care about any of that. I'm pissed off. And like, I've already started this purpose-driven career. And like somebody has to tell them that, somebody has to hold them accountable, I guess. And so when I got to speak to you guys, it felt like a great opportunity to at least let people know what was going on in these, like the hollowed walls of places like Harvard Law. So it was kind of a no-brainer for me. And in retrospect, it was a bigger decision than I realized it was. Yeah. But
I want you both to say more about that, because you both had this worlds in which you were incredibly private, right? And then both of you became incredibly public. What didn't you anticipate? You know, what was that like navigating that?
Eesh. It was really intense. Like, so I knew obviously that Harvard and like, well, I knew that the institution wouldn't take being like called out and criticized laying down, because it's Harvard and their reputation is like even more important than the reputation of the man that they were protecting. I didn't expect that like the law professors whose decisions I'd question would take it so personally, and come after me, in a way that felt so personally. I didn't think, I don't know, I didn't know people would care about my story in that way, or that I would be picked apart in the way that I would. I thought I would be speaking out as one of dozens of people who are speaking in your film, and kind of be seen in that context. And I realized later, as kind of like the attacks kept coming in and these like particular ways of questioning my credibility came in, I was like, well, I am a Black woman in the public eye, standing up for myself, which, like, how dare I, in a country where the denial of bodily autonomy to women, especially Black women, is kind of foundational. And I'm taking on a sacred white patriarchal institution like Harvard Law. And like, you can't really ignore that context. And yeah, it was rough. I wish it had been different. And I wish that the public had been more, I don't want to say ready to hear those stories, but I guess I wish the public had been more ready. You know, there are like all of these very typical attacks that everyone who shares a story about sexual assault faces, where like, you know, people don't want to hold men accountable for the violence they inflict. They want to hold women accountable for failing to avoid it. And there are all these really predictable attacks that somehow just seem so seductive for media. And like one person wrote a critical story just questioning like, well, why was she drinking around him? And like, is like a little bit of, you know, trying to do sex stuff to a woman who's passed out, is that worth like destroying a young man's future? And people ran with it. It was like this one story and like reason.com and all of these other people just bid on it. And they were like, yeah, like how freaking dare she try to jeopardize a young man's future? And it was just this weird, really messed up cultural moment. I guess we've been in it for centuries, but like I knew that that was the world that I was sharing my story in, but somehow being in the middle of it still felt kind of like being blindsided.
Yeah. I agreed to press charges within 24 hours of the assault before I even knew that I had been assaulted truly, and that I didn't know what the charges were. And I had already said yes. And so it's a little bit funny to me when people say you're so courageous. I'm like, yes, I will take that compliment, but I didn't totally do this on purpose. You know, I was like, dang, I didn't really sign up for this. Like, I didn't want to be the one like charging into battle with my sword raised. I was just sort of put on a train and with an unknown destination, and it was impossible to get off that train. Like once it started and things were set in motion, I had to figure out how to keep adapting. And I always felt like my life for the past 6 years has always been one step ahead of me. Like I have to figure out how to become this person who can take on the next obstacle. Like I have to figure out how to testify. I have to figure out how to write a book in order to finally reconnect with my life and reconnect with my authentic identity. And so that's what my experience has been like. I will say that something wonderful about coming forward, and that I think we should acknowledge, is that when someone comes forward and, you know, says they've been assaulted, it's not only a bomb dropping it's also an acknowledgement. It's this like beautiful, almost celebration of them announcing that this happened and they're still here. So it's not a party, obviously, but I think there's something very powerful, not just to rush to her aid and say, oh no, what do we do? There's that piece. And then there's also the piece of just awe, like, wow, you're here now, you're on the other side. And that's a wonderful thing. I do think because I was anonymous so long, I was just aware of how easy it is to conceal things. And that made me really wary. It made me start to think about just how embedded these situations are and how good we are at keeping them below the surface sometimes. Like that so many of survivors are just operating in day-to-day life. We talk to them every day and don't know it. But it's just so common and so normalized. And I think people have this idea of survivors as like shadowy figures who are struggling to speak and we've been muted and it's this dark realm we've been cast into, when really it's like, no, I'm showing up for my life every day, but I'm holding this huge, really painful thing and I don't know where to put it. And I'm looking for a space in society where I can finally like put it down. But it's everywhere, you know, it's and it can look like so many things.
And it's so important you say that, because the fact that it's everywhere is why we really need to have these kind of conversations, right? I mean, and I love what you said at the start about it's not a celebration, but if someone shares their story, it's not just that they're here, but that they felt safe enough to be vulnerable and show up in the world that way, right? I mean, as one prosecutor in doing all these films, she sat down and she said, you know, I couldn't get juries for years. I couldn't get them to understand how hard it is for these women to testify. She was defending prostitutes who'd been raped. So she goes like, good luck with that. And juries were not swayed at all. And finally, she sat them all down once and she said, everyone in this room, I want you all right now to think about the last time you had sex. Okay, everyone got it? Everyone got it? Okay, great, you know. All right, who wants to tell us about it? Stand up, the room full of strangers, come on. Anyone? And no one would, because it was a positive experience. What's your problem? Let's go. You know, right. And it was like, and a light bulb went off and she said, so why do you think my client, who's got a lot better things to do with her time, and she could be making a lot more money for this hour, would want to come up and talk about a horror, you know, a sexual experience that wasn't pleasurable. And you guys are, you know, so it's just so interesting. So what you said, that's resonated with me, because it is, for us, sex is such a private, intimate thing that even then, like going to the space of talking about it is a different level for most people. So I thought that was beautiful in what you said. And then the second part also made me think of what one of our executive producers has always told me. She said, and it's true, is that all of us are either a survivor, either have a loved one who's or friend or close acquaintance who's a survivor, or have a loved friend or acquaintance who's a close survivor, and we'll never know it. It's just one of those three things for everybody walking around on this planet. And that's why we all have to, and that's, you know, all of these things have like sort of impelled me to keep sort of telling these stories in the way that I do, and trying to, and I'm so grateful to all of you for having the courage to come forward. But Kamilah, what would you say is one of the things you, from all your experience, from all you've learned, especially being a Black woman, which is a totally different, which also I do want to say, for those that don't know, we did Hunting Ground and it had several survivors in it. Kamilah's was the most prominent story of someone who's Black survivor, and she's the only one that got the vicious blowback. And what year was this, Kamilah?
It came out 2015, yeah.
I can't remember my children's names, let alone anything that happened before yesterday. So thank you. So 2015, but you know, I don't see that as an accident. I think, you know, so my heart was broken, and I feel bad in retrospect that I didn't have the consciousness to understand or see that coming in that way. So, but anyways, I wanted to say, given all that you have gone through, what advice do you have, or formative advice do you have to other women of color who have suffered in this way? What have you learned, you know?
My gosh, so much. Like if I ever write a book, it'll be about these lessons. One of the main things is like, I mean, what Chanel said about it is a victory just like being able to come forward and tell your story. And in any context, I don't mean just in like a disciplinary or law enforcement context, because that's a whole other trauma. And we put so much pressure on that. And so like one, just like find someone to talk to, because there are there are guaranteed to be other people in your life who've been through the same thing. And being able to talk about it is also a victory, because it means that you know that it was wrong and that you didn't deserve what happened to you. And if you're angry about it, that anger can feel like such a burden. Like I'd never felt so much rage in my life. It scared the crap out of me. And someone, I think it might have been my lawyer from the Victim Rights Law Center, was like, good. That anger means that you know that this was wrong and you're not internalizing that experience. And so finding anyone, whether it's a therapist or a friend, to talk to about it and just like be witnessed in that, and knowing that you didn't deserve this, that this shouldn't have happened to you. And even though our society sets us up to have these experiences, it was still wrong, is pretty monumental. And the other thing that I learned is that, so I approached these processes of like trying to seek accountability for my assailant, from my school for enabling him. And I felt like in order to redeem myself, in order to have some measure of healing, something had to happen to him. He had to face some consequences. Otherwise, like, you know, maybe he was right and I am just, you know, nothing more than this, you know, whatever, doll to be used or something. And realizing in retrospect, like I did not get justice or much of a measure of accountability for either, that like my healing actually doesn't have to be tied to what happens to my aggressor. We can go on with our lives. I think we're sold this idea that like people want to have some sense of control. So the narrative is like, you need to tell someone, you need to tell law enforcement. And like among, especially Black people, the idea of getting law enforcement involved is really complex, because we're incredibly vulnerable to violence. And we also have to acknowledge that like most interpersonal violence is intraracial. And we're in a society that's not only patriarchal, but deeply white supremacist. And I think, who was it? Shanita Hubbard put this really beautifully in a piece that like, we have to bear this violence and also the expectation that we will protect the men who are tormenting us, because there's a greater threat at large, which is, you know, these systems that are basically an extension of slavery and will chew us all up. Yeah, I guess not internalizing the failures of the criminal justice system and the inapproachability of it. And I think as a society, as communities, we really need to invest resources in developing and understanding levers of accountability outside of the criminal justice system, because it does not work for Black women, and it doesn't work for most victims of sexual violence. And that's not to say that there shouldn't be any accountability or justice, but we're not getting it there, and we do need other tools.
I wanted to know, do you two have any questions for each other?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, it is funny. I forgot, when I listen to Kamilah speak, I forget that I'm a panelist, because it just feels really good to hear someone who's been in that space articulate those feelings. And I guess now I've been public for a little while now, so I feel positioned to be the one showing up, a little bit beaming, a little bit wise, and it's so nice to be able to sit back and just remember how much I still need to hear these things too. Like, even if we are so educated and we've been through it all and can speak very clearly about what has happened, it's so interesting I do still need to be nourished. I do still need to hear these things again and again, to let them truly sink in. And even like the response from the statement going viral, I received so many letters, just an outpouring of letters. And I would read a few every single day and really try to listen to them and like actively let those generous comments rewire my system, reframe how I saw myself as someone who is courageous and capable and kind and who does have a lot to offer. But I think even now, down the line, I've gotten awards for the book, and that's wonderful. And I still possess so much self-doubt at times, you know, and I sometimes think like, what's it going to take, and why is my level of self-doubt and sometimes self-loathing so deep? Like, and it's because, again, it's sort of everywhere. It's the messages we've been fed for a long, long time. But just, when I'm in these spaces, I just remember, whoa, I need to continue to seek out these spaces to continue to sustain what I'm doing.
That's really beautiful. And I feel the same way listening to you speak, Chanel. It's like we have such tragic things in common, and like experiences that so many women share, but also some that are pretty unique, you know, like being a public survivor and, you know, going through criminal trial and like all of that stuff. And when I hear you talk about it, it's the same thing. I'm like, I need to hear someone say these things and speak about it in this way. And one thing that's particularly inspired me about the way that you approach telling your story is how conscious you've been about healing. And I really admire that about you. And that's one of those things that, like, if I could do anything differently, I would, you know, yeah, I guess walk into my situation holding open the possibility of healing, which I didn't until kind of much later. I like bought into the idea that it was a foregone conclusion, that, you know, you talked about this stereotype of victims. It's just like these hollowed out shells of people who are like, you know, I'm lost, but maybe I can save someone else. And that's kind of how I felt. And when I hear you speak about consciously holding on to yourself through everything that you've endured, and taking care of yourself as you also share yourself with the world, is really remarkable to me. And I hope that other and younger survivors learn many things from you, but especially that.
Thank you. Yeah, I honestly always attribute it to my weird little superpower, which was having my younger sister be a part of the trial, which is something that I never would have wanted and would have prevented if I could have. But having her little eyes on me that entire time, I understood what was at stake if I gave up on myself. And I couldn't let that hollowed image be the one that I was giving to her all the time, you know? And so that, I do think that saved me in a lot of ways. It also is so much easier to fight for other people than it is yourself. I think we tolerate a lot of abuse if it's just us. We can absorb and absorb and absorb. I don't know to what extent, but with her, I have no tolerance, not even like a centimeter of wiggle room. So as soon as I saw her starting to hollow out, I was like, whoa, we need to reverse this now. Like, I have to figure out how to fight this now and show up, because of that can't happen. Like, there's no reality in which I let that happen. And then as a result of figuring out how to fight for her, I figured out how to fight for myself. And I think for all survivors, like, so much of it is altruistic, right? Like, what is in it for us? what is that? But we show up for each other, and we're fueled by each other's stories, and we support one another. But it's so, yeah, on an individual basis, it is totally freaky, and that care is complicated. But we have this thread, like we are connected through this strange nightmare. And yet that's such a wonderfully like intimate thing that we can hop onto a Zoom for the first time together and be able to like swim this deep, you know, so instantly. And I think that's great that we have this language of empathy as a result of what has happened.
And that the altruism chain can continue because you're both saying yes to speaking, which is not an easy yes, is helping others. I know everybody who's watching this will have that same feeling, you know, that you're having with each other, you know, of feeling seen, heard, you know, recognize something in themselves, not alone. And it is so profound. Yeah.
And what you said about how much easier it is to fight for other people is so true. And that is another piece of advice that I just remembered that someone gave me when I was struggling to take care of myself during my ordeal was to imagine that I'm looking at a good friend going through what I was going through. And so when I walked out of the trial and I saw those jurors' faces looking at me so suspiciously, and I was like, wow, I fucked that up. You know, or like all of the things I should have done differently. I should have dressed more humbly. I should, you know, all of these things. And then it's like, okay, wait, if I stop and imagine, you know, a dear friend saying those things to me about herself, I'd be like, stop it. You're amazing. You've just done something so courageous and you deserve a break. And it's so much easier to kind of learn to nurture when it's not yourself. Because when it's just you going through these things, there's so many expectations that we can just, you know, endure it all because we have to. And like we think that strength means, you know, not acknowledging how soft and wounded we might feel and just pushing through it.
I'm more interested in hearing from you guys. You're much I mean, I don't want to be like, yeah, I'm just like,
Amy, welcome to the show.
bring it. But something both of you said also made me think of all this. Forget what happened to you. All of us are navigating like the patriarchal toxic poison, right? And so, you know, you have all this self-hate, self-doubt, what you all were saying, you know, is compounded exponentially by the traumatic event. And then you try and get out of that traumatic event, and yet you're still in a patriarchal society where we're used to sort of self-doubt, non-validation, self-criticism, you know, our whole inner tape, because that's all we've been fed, right? You know, unconsciously and unconsciously. And it makes it compounds the difficulty of showing up for yourself because you don't like yourself, because we live in a society that teaches women not to like themselves and not to like other women, and you know, to show up in a certain way that might not be our way, but because we think these are the societal norms we have to conform to. So it's all this sort of constant, you know, torquing and gymnastics we have to do, which makes self-care and self-love not our second nature, right? So then when you have a traumatic event, if that's not a muscle we've learned to train with and exercise, that's not there for you to come out of with.
Okay, so that also brings up another point, which is that, you know, for me, I blacked out, right? So I don't remember the assault itself. And I remember showing up to trial feeling so humiliated that I was supposed to be the keystone and I had nothing. And so I thought that meant that my experience was worth nothing, right? Because all I have is this black hole. But that is just living off of the misconception that assault takes place in this contained time frame, which it never does. You have to incorporate the whole story, which is who you were before this, how you were changed, how every element of your life that was disrupted, where it spit you out, what happens in the aftermath. And the before and after are so potent with experiences and emotions and damage. And it's part of why I wanted to write the memoir, because the story of my case is on Wikipedia. You can get that fine, but all of that rich matter is after. And I don't think people realize that we all play a role in that after, whether you want to or not. Like you said, we all exist in survivors' lives. and we can be actively helping them or educating ourselves to better support them, or just passively let everything happen. But that to me is like, it's so much more interesting, and where so much more of our time should be spent is investigating, like, what worlds are we being returned to? What voices are we met with? What forces are we coming up against in trying to voice these assaults? It's, the assault is like act one, you know, and then everything follows. But I think we need to talk, when we talk about these things, we need to talk about the whole story.
I totally agree. Especially seeing the media and public digest so many stories during the peak of the recent iteration of the Me Too movement. It's like there's this compulsion. We just look at the aggressor and like, who was he before he raped this woman? What did he accomplish? Ooh, big guy. Okay. And like, okay, so he had this night, but like, what are the consequences for him? And like, let's talk about his life and what he's losing, what he stands to lose, and how can he get it back? And I'm just like, are you kidding? You know? And all of the survivors are completely erased from this narrative. It's like, oh yeah, she was deeply hurt and like, good luck to her. But our stories are so much more interesting. Like, let's talk about what our lives were like before these often derailing experiences happened to us, and what our futures looked like then, and what our futures look like afterwards, and what possibilities we still have open to us. And like, what does healing look like? And how can our communities, how can our industries support us in healing? Like, all of those questions, we just completely drop the ball on. And it's, you know, it's up to people like you to be like, hi, here I am, and I'm still writing my story. I'm still here. I'm a full person, okay? Not just like, you know, victim in this case, victim of so-and-so who now has to face consequences or not. It's really amazing that like we have to claw ourselves out of invisibility. And I think especially for survivors who fall so far outside of this mythological idea of the perfect victim, not only women of color, but like trans and non-binary survivors, male survivors were completely erased. You know, like people don't want to talk about it, acknowledge our existence. Like barely can acknowledge that these events happen to us. Right. And like, that's a place where I want to see a lot more work being done, listening to us. Don't just, you know, grit your teeth while we tell our stories after the awful thing itself happens, but like listen to us and what we need to be whole again and like exist in the world as full people again.
Totally. Yeah, it's like listen and keep listening. So even after the Me Too movement, right? It's like so great. You have all these people breaking the surface and saying this is what happened. But what a gift it would be if we continued to ask about them and their lives and what they want to do, and like followed up with these stories. Mm-hmm. Because that's not the story. It is part of who they are, but then let's ask who they are now, you know? And I so appreciate some of the assignments I've been getting recently that have to do with art. I mean, like, can you draw something? And that to me is someone saying like, what else do you want to say? You know, because I don't only want to say this thing. We're not public figures just to give voice to a traumatic incident. Like, we all have a lot to say on a variety of topics because we had abundant lives prior to the assault and interests of our own. And so I think it's worth investigating that too, like long-term, continuing to help survivors evolve and give voice to different stories, because it's so wonderful to witness that. I would say to survivors, know that the story of what happened is not your burden to carry, but it is actually a gift, and others should receive it as a gift and say, wow, this person has trusted me with this valuable thing, and I'm going to sit with them, and I'm not going to try and fix everything, but at least I'm going to hold it with them. I think it took me a really long time to reframe my story, because at first I thought it was something really dark that people wanted to extract from me to figure out this case. It was just like vultures coming to get it. And it was also something I didn't want my family to see because it was dark matter. And over time, I realized that it's this glowing thing. And that if I'm asked to do an interview, like, they should be lucky, to receive this glowing thing with all of this information and these intimate experiences. Like, to receive these stories is a gift, right? So know that you possess something very precious and actually valuable to society, because if we listen properly, we can do something. It's not a personal failure. And then, to address the quote from my mom, she, always told me, just kept reassuring me that like life is bigger than what I can imagine. And it's true, because so much of what has happened is beyond my imagination. Like, what if you told me before the trial, it's chill, like, you're going to get your words to Amy and she's going to release it, and then you'll have your book translated globally. That's like so silly. I wouldn't even have believed it if you told me. And yet that's reality. And, over a year ago, I was in Amsterdam promoting the book, and I met this male ballerina who had taken audio from me reading my statement and choreographed this beautiful piece. And he was showing it to me on his phone, and we were eating soup. And I was like, I am eating soup with a ballerina in Amsterdam. Like, and my story has helped create this piece. I mean, there's things like that I just can't wrap my head around. So I just hope you know that life is bigger than whatever narrative you feel like you're currently trapped in. But life is so expansive and wants you in it. As long as you just like hang in there, no narrative can trap you in, because your life is too big for that.
That was beautiful. I guess what I would say to survivors is, I don't know, one, that you don't owe anyone your story, and you don't owe anyone your silence, whether you choose to quietly try to move on, or you are shouting out from the rooftops, trying to get accountability for the people who harmed you. Any decision that you make in the aftermath, what to do with your story and how to move on with your life, is powerful and incredibly courageous. Your only responsibility, the only thing that you need to be held accountable to, is your own healing and doing whatever you can to recover. And I had this idea of healing be like, you like wave a wand and like the hurtful, tragic things don't hurt anymore. You don't have to grieve. And that's not quite it. It's coming to terms with your trauma, coming to terms with the grief and the rage, and making room for them in your life so that they don't control you or weigh on you so heavily. And it's something that every survivor deserves, no matter what happened to you, what you did before or after the assault. We all deserve that. And to loved ones of survivors, whether you know you have survivors in your life or not, like, one is to be mindful of how you talk about these issues when they come up, because the survivors in your life are listening, and we are likely internalizing things or taking note of who we can actually talk to and trust, and who may not have our backs. And like Chanel said, if somebody does honor you and trust you with their story, it's not your job to fix it. It's not your job to try to assure them that things aren't as bad as they feel. It's your job to be there and give them the space to be in whatever grief they're feeling, whatever rage they're feeling. Yes, it is bad. Yes, this is unjust. This sucks. It should not have happened. I can't fix it, and that's fine. Let them know that their feelings aren't a burden to you, and that you were strong enough and compassionate enough to be by their side and just with them in it. That's all that I ever wanted, was for friends to just be in this uncomfortable crappy, dark space with me, which is a lot to ask, but it's easier than trying to come up with solutions to things that can't be fixed in the moment.
Well, thank you both. It was a privilege to talk with you and such a pleasure to finally meet you, Chanel. You've loomed large in my consciousness and large in my heart for a very, very long time. So I'm glad you actually exist.
Yeah, it's such a gift to be connected with you both. I will never get tired of conversations like these, and they're so replenishing. So thank you for being here with me.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you, Kamilah. I love you.
I love you too. And it's always, it's always great being in conversation with you, Amy. The way that you lead these conversations is so intentional, and it makes it somehow comfortable to talk about the worst things. And Chanel, I've had so much love for you since the Emily Doe days. And it's just like, it's really an honor to speak with you and meet you. And I hope we can stay in touch.
Absolutely.